Hey Dr. JP, I hope you're doing well. Currently making this video for my review of the book When in Romans by Gaventa. So here we go. The book When in Romans by Gaventa provides a deep overview of the entirety of the letter of Romans, its context and intent, what it means for modern readers today. She even argues that with the book of Romans, we can tend to make weekend visits. In chapter 1, she explains that so much of the Christian encounter with Scripture, especially with Protestants, in general consists of skimming the surface, looking for easy answers or slogans, settling for something that can be controlled or manipulated by our own ends. Rather than viewing the depth of the entirety of the letter, Protestants and many Christians can tend to jump around and focus on specific portions of the letter rather than going in great depth. However, Gaventa claims that we need to read Romans with its entirety in mind as a developing argument. Throughout the chapters, she then dives into how understanding this letter requires us to dive into the themes of salvation, identity, ethics, and community that are present throughout the entirety of the letter. I greatly appreciated how Gaventa affirms God's work through Abraham, similarly to what we talked about in class the other day. Gaventa discusses how Abraham is an example of what God has done, and not through Abraham's own character alone, but rather it's a testament of God's character and who he is. God stays faithful to his promise through Abraham, even when he acts in disobedience. But sometimes Protestants can view this example of Abraham in Romans as a place to affirm his great character rather than God's. And so I really found that as a major point of praise throughout the book that I found was really impactful for me. I also love how she brings clarity to explain the role of the Israelites in the letter. She argues that Paul claimed that Israel belonged to God and not God belonging to Israel. She makes it clear that Paul explains that both Jews and Gentiles belong to God through the line of Abraham. In other words, God has redeemed us all through Christ and not just the Jews. Lastly, a third point of praise that I found was really interesting was that she shows us how Paul claims the church to be God's alone. As God's church, not only do we glorify God, but we also experience suffering. As the church today, this reality can be easily glossed over, and Gaventa asserts that suffering is a huge part of being joined with Christ and being one body as the church, and that ultimately we're not ourselves. The church is not separate from God, but we belong to God as a church. I truly enjoyed this book, and I really struggled finding critical points or critiques or judgments about the book. However, I did find two claims from Gaventa that would definitely be critical points for those coming from more traditional evangelical traditions or even those from the Reformed tradition. And those two critical points would be her discussion of cosmic salvation in describing Christian ethics. When looking at cosmic salvation, Gaventa claims that cosmic salvation concerns God's powerful action in Jesus Christ to reclaim humanity, individual and corporate, from the powers of sin and death. For someone coming from a more Reformed background, they would hear this quote and would point it as a critique because of how Gaventa focused less on personal sin and individual faith and looks more at the community as a whole, which typically in more traditional and Reformed evangelical circles, that is not as highlighted, and personal sin and personal salvation is more highlighted. When it comes to describing Christian ethics, Gaventa does not emphasize the need to follow specific commands. And I could see for a Reformed or traditional believer that this could be a point of critique because following commands and guidelines brings more practicality on specific living and Christian practices. But Gaventa explains that the best starting place for thinking about how we live is to think about how we worship. And she has a whole chapter about talking about how she claims that Paul views worship as the center of of just Christian living, and that just following commands and practices was not his intent, but for other traditions that's what it seems to be. Those commands and those having practical things to follow are more at the center, but Gaventa pushes back on that and says that Paul's really diving into the heart of worship behind anything for how we live and how we live as Christians. One thing I learned while reading this book is that in terms of ethics, Gaventa shows that Paul is, again, what I talked about earlier, Paul is concerned about our connection with worship and behavior. In chapter 3, Gaventa discusses how when we make our periodic visits to Romans, we go in search of Christian doctrine rather than worship. But Paul is trying to show his readers that what we worship truly affects our behavior, and Gaventa makes this strong argument. But sometimes when we strictly look through Romans for doctrine on Christian living, we forget to see that the center of our worship affects who we are truly worshiping and trusting in. Overall, I give this book a big thumbs up. Gaventa argues that as modern readers, we truly need to read Romans with its entirety in mind and not cherry pick verses out of context. I know I can definitely be convicted of this, and I know others can as well. And so it challenged me in a different way, and to truly look at the book of Romans with a more in-depth and broader view rather than just pinpointing specific verses that I want to interpret in my own presuppositions. Understanding the development of Paul's argument throughout the letter helps us convey the message he's communicating through salvation, identity, ethics, and community. Other students should totally read this text due to that it just provides this reality and a reminder that when reading any biblical book, we are to give justice to the context, the literary style, the audience, and the themes behind the text in order to determine what the author's message was to the readers at the time and how it can relate to us today, and ultimately how God is speaking through the text. So again, not only was it important to understand that we need to read Romans in its entirety and in its depth, but it's also challenges us as readers to do this with any biblical book, that we should always come to the text with a deeper knowledge and not just pick single verses out and determine meaning from those. But yeah, that's my review of the book. Again, big thumbs up. Great book. Really liked it. Short, easy read. All right, awesome. See you, JP.